right, thank you everybody for your patience as we figure out the details of the Zoom room. Thanks for joining us for our next Sustainability Research Seminar. We're very happy to have Oscar Melo visiting us from the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile, where he's an associate professor of agricultural and resource economics, does a lot of interesting work on various food systems, fisheries, forestry, a lot of work on water. Today, he's going to be talking to us about the energy, water, food nexus and how that pertains to adaptation to climate change in particular. So we'll talk for about 40, 45 minutes. We'll have a little bit of time for questions, and then we're going to do a hard stop at 1 p.m. because we'll have refreshments out in the courtyard after that so we can continue the conversation. So thank you very much, and we'll hand it over to Oscar.
Thank you, Ryan. Great. So it's a pleasure. It's an honor to be here. Thank you for coming. So today I'm going to be talking about the concept of the Nexus. And I know some of you work on the Nexus, so bear with me, please, because I'm going to do a little bit of an explanation for those of you who have never heard of this concept. And I'm going to be talking about some applications of the concept to specifically South America, and in particularly questions related to sustainable development and climate change. So what is the Nexus approach? So we can think of the Nexus as a methodological approach in the sense that it helps us understand and do research about management of natural resources. But I would say the key is the fact that we're integrating different systems. Obviously, water, energy, the environment, agriculture, food production. So I think what this approach tries to emphasize, and I'm not sure I can use my pointer here, but you can read it there, is that there's a limited nature in terms of the availability of these resources. So it is pointing to the scarcity, but also to the interconnectedness of these resources, okay? And moreover, the complexity. And I think probably this is one of the reasons why this has not been done so easily before, and it's not completely new, the approach, right? But the idea is to integrate sometimes complex models that address different resources and try to understand a more connected, complete, holistic question. And this is important because usually you have competing interests in the sense that you might have part of the population or interest groups that are looking to increase, for example, the availability of water, but that might contradict with environmental objectives, or it might contradict with the production of more energy. So there's obviously some win-win situations where you can improve two of these elements, or maybe three, but it's more common that there could be, trade-offs to be made. And that's, I think, the root and the key to this approach, to try to understand those trade-offs and to propose policies, sustainable policies that can address these issues. So in a paper some time ago with several co-authors, we looked into the principles to incorporate what we call climate services, the idea that you have to look into data to understand the climate change data, climate data, and incorporate it to this approach. So in this figure, basically you can see, right, these three elements, the water here, land, and energy, and how they interconnect. So the arrows, the blue arrows, show some examples of how they're connected. Right? So you need, for example, energy to pump groundwater, but you could use also water to generate hydroelectricity. Right? So there is an obvious connection, and these are just examples. And then you could need energy, right, to cultivate the land, fertilizers, and so on. But you could also use the land to cultivate bioenergy crops, for example. So there's also that connection. And of course, there is a need for water for cultivating the land, producing crops. And there's also, right, the relationship between the land and the water. And at the center of all this are stakeholders, right? Their needs, and how do we address the different needs, and sometimes competing needs. So how do we evaluate a policy that might be trying to address maybe one issue, but it's going to have an effect on other issues? So this is where things get a bit complex. And in brown here, we have some, variables that tell us a little bit about the state or the relevance of each of these elements to try to understand how they are doing. So they're like a performance index that we can connect also to, sustainable development goals for each of them. Okay, so we can have metrics in terms of where we want to reach and what are the actions we want to be looking at. Okay, so the point of the Nexus then is trying to understand these trade-offs from a point of view of resources management, but this can also be done from a point of view of the demand of the services that these resources produce. Okay, so for example, for water, we can think in terms of water security. For land or food production, we could think in terms of food security and energy security. So it has like a double-sided view, a view that is more like in production management, but also in terms of providing the needs for the stakeholders, for society, for communities. So what are climate services? Climate services are basically the data, the information, the knowledge that is needed to do adaptation, mitigation, disaster management. So the idea is to transform this data into climate models that have a local or regional implication for communities, for socioeconomic system, for environmental systems. So they have to be useful, right? They have to be products that make sense or help make decisions. And something that many times is that they have to make sense, to the local communities. And sometimes there are a lot of models, but they're not answering the questions that communities are looking for. Okay. So this is what we are adding here. So the climate services, starting from global climate models, regional climate models, but also, right, the stakeholder narratives that come into this puzzle and help us understand complex systems. So sustainable agricultural development and the Nexus approach, we try to connect then this idea between these elements to strategies that are being used to improve the living standards of communities, of rural communities, and how the use of these resources might have some effects that are long-term or short-term and will be affecting the well-being of these communities. So key for this development, for making recommendations, for making policy recommendations, is understanding the effect that climate change is going to have, so that the policies are robust, are sustainable, and can propose this more integrated nature of the management of the resources. So let me talk now a little bit about some examples, some research projects, some case studies that we have done in the past. And the first here is a project we developed with some colleagues from the UK. We worked in Peru and in Ecuador. So the idea here was to provide policymakers with some evidence to support their policies. For those of you who have work in developing countries know that it's usually really tough to have a working relation with institutions there. And this was the case for us because we entered in these two countries, and after a few months, the authorities had already changed. There were some upheavals, there were presidential changes, there were ministries created and destroyed, so a lot of institutional changes. So we decided to work with a group of academics, NGOs, and some politicians that were part or not part of the government to give a more robust group of people advising us in terms of what was relevant for them. So the idea here was to try to understand the implications of the increasing food demand in areas that are focused mostly in export-oriented agriculture. But this growth in export agriculture is obviously causing a big impact in terms of resources, water demand, and there is a threat to the sustainability of this development. So we looked into these two cases that are similar in terms of the geography, the type of agriculture that's going on. On the top there is Santa Elena in Ecuador. It's a semi-arid area. Peru in the bottom. The Ica Valley is very dry, so it's a very dry desert that relies in water coming from the mountains, but also underground water. And the idea in these two places is we try to develop our understanding of what were the issues and develop models for each of these systems. So a model for the agriculture and also a model for the water. And in this paper, we presented a little bit the results for the case of Peru, the Ica Valley. The Ica Valley has been growing, and you can see here in this area how in 1919 there was almost no agriculture, and then in 2010, and we also did it for later, 2020, this has been growing a lot, this area, relying mostly on underground water. But the water level has been coming down, so there was a big concern on how sustainable was this development, which has had important implications for migration within the region. So a lot of people around this area were coming to live into Ica because of the employment that it was generating. Obviously, the city was not prepared, and there was also some issues providing water for that population. So this is the type of tools that we were developing. So we were integrating some irrigation simulation models, which is the green part here. Cannot see all the details, but the general idea is an irrigation model that takes into account crops, together with a life cycle assessment model to understand what are the environmental implications. And that is also connected with a socioeconomic analysis, looking at the generation of employment, profits. But this toolkit, the way we develop it, is not a completely integrated model, but it's rather what we call a soft link models. So these are really different models that talk to each other and give us a sense of what could happen in the future. In the socioeconomic module, so in this one here, one of the key questions was to understand the farmland allocation. So we developed a special model that was presented in a different paper, but the idea was to understand how farmers were making decisions and how different policies, for example, policies related to water, could affect the way farmers were making decisions and maybe moving from a crop that needs more water to a crop that needs less water. And this is key to understand what the labor offer is going to be and what the environmental impacts are going to be. So we proposed a model that is based on agricultural production functions that doesn't need very detailed data. So we needed data, but in most of these countries that we work, we don't have very detailed surveys about their costs. So it's an approximation where we base their relative net incomes as a decision. So there's a trade-off between two different crops, and farmers are deciding between these two crops based on their profit. And we construct that based on available data. And we use that model then to articulate the decision of land use. And we created 3 scenarios that were of interest in this community that had to do with reduced surface water availability, which was happening, reduced underground water availability, which was also happening, and an increase in agricultural product prices. So what happens if the agricultural boom continues? And we see the effects, and I'm not going to show all the results here, but with these models, we can see the effects in water demand, in energy demand, and employment, in profit, and other environmental issues. In this paper, though, we did work only with these 2 crops, grapes and asparagus, which are the most important, but the information we had was really not very good to work with the rest of the crops. But gives an idea, a sense of what alternative policies policymakers can implement. Then we worked in Ecuador. In this paper, we presented the methodology and the results, and we used a very similar toolkit. It was a bit different in the sense that we did not use the land allocation model. We did use the agricultural system, so there was a water hydraulic model, and the life cycle assessment model. So the life cycle assessment model, again, was telling us the carbon footprint, the land use, the resource depletion, and the water model was telling us what would be the demand for water for each scenario. And then the socioeconomic analysis was, again, telling us a little bit about the income, the labor, and how the different crop mix would end up resulting. So in this case, the scenarios were a bit different. We had, in the end, these 3 scenarios looking at possible futures for this region. A possible future would be an agro-export oriented development, so mostly large farms that access the world markets, or maybe stimulating a more self-consumption, sustainable consumption of small farmers, or a strategy that would maximize employment and reduce the environmental impact. So we work on these scenarios and we do analysis in terms of the different dimensions. How would this result for each of the dimensions? So it's interesting to know that there was a different approach between the regional government and the national government. They had clearly very different objectives. The local government was more interested in poor farmers, in developing their strategies to produce food, and the national government was looking more at the export and generation of income for the country. In this work, we did something a bit different, and I'm going to move to now a different way of understanding the Nexus, because we're going to connect it now with the provision of drinking water. And in this work, we worked in the basin where the city of Santiago in Chile is located. And we tried to understand what are the options for adapting to climate change, taking into account the water utility service, but also agriculture. And again, we published this a while ago, trying to understand what's going on in this basin. So Santiago is the largest city, it's the capital of the country, about 6 million people. There is hydropower, there are industries, there's agriculture, there's tourism. A lot of that depends on water. And we modeled different adaptation strategies or measures. One of them could be increasing the storage capacity, so building new reservoirs, for example. The other strategy that we looked was that water utilities would buy water rights permanently. So this would be water right transactions. How much would that cost? And the third alternative is to lease water through option contracts. So the idea of an option contract is that the water utility would sign a contract with farmers that in case there is a drought, to the water utility. So it's a pre-agreement or an agreement that it's triggered by different storage levels or a level of a drought. Okay? And the way we implemented this is using these multi-objective evaluation platforms where we do an evaluation of these alternative measures, and we have a simulation model that uses this genetic algorithm to present all possible combinations. So this is done through a software that is called PWR, that is written in Python and is specially developed for water resources management. And it replicates many possible futures, so it takes into account climate change projections, but it also takes into account the alternative measures. So what would happen if we build a reservoir? Combine that with all the scenarios of climate change. And then what would happen if we do all the other alternatives? And from there, we get a series of results in terms of these three measures. Okay, so we look at the effects of reservoir, as I was saying. So there we have the curve of cost of reservoirs of different capacities. This is based on water rights traded, so we define what would be the price of water rights. And we also look at the price of option contracts, looking at the demand of water in agriculture and hydroelectric production. And the results look a bit messy, and this is the type of results that we get in the sense that it gives us different alternatives. So there's not one result, there are millions actually of results, and the algorithm refines the results to those that are superior in terms of being the maximal in this target variables. And from there, you can work with the community to say, okay, what do you want to maximize? You want to have more reliability, you want to have more resilience, you want to lower your cost, you want to focus on the environmental side, for example, putting a minimum output flow of water, and you can start looking at what options, what measures you should take to achieve these objectives. So it's not like giving one possible solution, but it's more like mapping the possible outcomes of different strategies. Now, back a little bit to agriculture. We did a similar work, but instead of looking at only one basin and the production of energy within that basin, we did this in a different basin in Chile, the Maule Basin, where we try to understand now the connection between these three things in a basin that has a more relevant energy production. So this is a basin where a relevant share of the electricity production in Chile is generated. Here is a little map of the basin, and you can see that there is like a narrow point here. So the water is collected here, it goes through channels and a river, and the electricity is generated there, and then all this area is the agricultural area where the water is placed. The problem is that it might need the water that is needed for electricity, I'm sorry, is not needed at the same time as agriculture. So here we look at 14 climate scenarios using 7 global models and 2 projections. So we combined several climate scenarios, and this has been done at the national level, and we have a repository in Chile that's called ArcClim that gathers all this information, and it's available. So we just use that information that is like the official information. And then we look at the water demand of different crops and how they are affected by changes, and how would their yields, for example, be affected. How this would have impacts, again, on profits and so on and so forth. And then we accumulate all these results and choose some of the key variables that help us understand what would happen in these futures. So, for example, in the top graph here, we look at resilience versus reliability in agriculture. And these are indices, so it tells us how it could improve. Thank you very much. So, how it would improve the reliability, understanding that this means having enough water for what is being cultivated and not, not being able to irrigate all the necessary water. So each of these points represent one of these climate scenarios, and at the same time, the color represents the amount of annual flow of how much water this scenario would have. And below, we combine the results for agriculture. So these are income or profit generation for agriculture and profit generation for hydropower. So we can see the trade-off between different scenarios in the case of agriculture and in the case of hydropower generation. And then we combine that with the measures that we were analyzing. So we see the effect that the measures would have in this type of metrics, and see how effective they are in achieving, improving, for example, the benefits, the profits that they generate, or reducing resilience. And of course, again, there's not one answer, and here it's even more complicated because we have several scenarios, and it's really hard to say, well, which is the best climate scenario? Nobody can tell, right? There are different scenarios, but it gives us a sense of where things could be moving and what could be the effect of these different adaptation measures, which in this case were increased efficiency, reduction in the available water for agriculture, and also a change in the way the reservoir was managed. And we also have the type of results that we had in the previous study, in the sense that we have several variables and several alternative possible results, right? So depending on what the community, the policymaker wants to focus, you can say, okay, if I want more agricultural reliability, how, for example, is going to fall the profit for hydroelectric generation? And you can start playing with these levers and see what the impacts would be. We also have done a little bit of research more related to ecosystems. And the idea here was to try to understand what the impact of hydropower generation would be on the ecosystem. This was at a time where hydropower was being promoted in Chile. This has reduced in the past few years, but is still an important issue. And there is, of course, a lot of negative sentiment in terms of the environmental impact that this generation, this system of generating electricity has. So we were exploring the trade-offs between the environmental impacts and economic impacts. So what we did here is try to understand the specific impact on fish. These are freshwater fish. In Chile, we have about 45 species. And how this would connect with energy growth. So obviously there is constant energy growth. And at the time, hydropower was being seen as the best alternative. That has changed a little bit now. Now Chile has moved more into solar panel and wind generation, so it has moved away from hydropower. But at the same time, the many regions and the zone that we're going to be studying was undergoing important land use changes, so a growth in agriculture and an expansion of urban areas. Again, climate change is playing an important role in terms of affecting all of these interactions, so it's complex systems. And the decisions are typically made only looking at one aspect. So what is the environmental impact, or what is the energy that can be generated, but never looking at things combined to better assess the decisions. So in this project, we develop a tool that can map those trade-offs and that can help us understand their connection. So the point where this study begins is trying to understand the ecology of fish and where can we find different species of fish in a basin. So it's a niche model. I'm not the expert in that part, right? My colleagues developed this model, but the idea is to try to have a model that can predict the probability of finding a fish based on variables like temperature, precipitation, land use connected to those areas, and also the presence of infrastructure, for example, dams, within the river. And with that type of modeling, then we again went to build scenarios for the future. So we look at the climate change scenarios, how in this case, precipitations are gonna be reduced, how land is gonna change, land use is gonna change, so agricultural expansion, and what infrastructure, for example, dams, we could expect. So we had several scenarios based on the policies that were being discussed at the time, and we could see how that would change the probability of finding certain fish in different parts of the river. And we focus especially in fish that are endangered in terms of extinction, and we came up with this type of results, which combine the economic value generated by the agriculture and the hydropower industry with, it's not exactly a probability of extinction, but how would it change the probability of finding these fish in different areas for different species. And let me close down my presentation just by saying where we're moving in terms of our research. So I think this Nexus approach can help us deal with very complex systems that are usually treated in a separate manner. Even the way we do research many times is not taking into account the effect, that other elements are very important. And I think here in Arizona State, the few days that I've been here, I've been impressed to learn that that's a little bit the way you approach things here, looking at the problem and doing a multidisciplinary work to address that problem. We are currently working in a multi-scale approach, so combining this idea of the Nexus with problems that are that transcend the basin. So most of the models that I showed you are based on a basin, so everything happens there. But we are working, and we have already the results of a problem where the electricity generation connects with a model that generates electricity for the whole country. So the decisions you make at the basin level affect the whole country. So you, for example, could decide to give more water to the farmers, but that implies more power generation from other sources, for example, diesel or electric power coming from solar, etc. So it could have impacts in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So again, it's not a completely integrated model, it's a soft link model, but it allows to make these decisions that have potential impact in a larger scale. We also are in a project looking at how water markets are affecting the real estate development in an area in Chile that is semi-arid, so there is very little water. And what has happened with the drought we have had in Chile for the past 10, 13 years is that there is a water market based on tracking. So there is a formal tracking of water, but there is also an informal tracking of water. It's not very regulated. And what that has meant is that anybody can build a house anywhere, almost anywhere, and a truck would come and provide you water. So this has really changed a little bit the way development of housing works. And there's been really very little understanding of how this works and what are the implications, especially in a context where there are a lot of illegal developments going on. So a lot of people are building second homes in areas that are not allowed. They don't own the land. They just start building, and then they're served illegally by these water trucks, and you start seeing little cities coming up out of nowhere. So we're looking into that. And we are also starting to prepare to build an agent-based modeling of water users, including farmers, but also including small rural communities that are also running out of water. So understanding how they make decisions in terms of the type of crops they select when they are under a drought, and what are these communities doing. For example, buying water from trucks or buying water from farmers. And also, we are trying to evaluate these water options that I mentioned in a different basin close to Santiago. We're trying to understand the economic impact. So what is the cost of transferring water from agriculture to water utilities? And we have done that in several workshops, so working with the water utilities and working with the farmers. And the farmers are usually not very interested in any compensation. So they really care about having the water and not that much about being compensated by a payment. But we had a recent change in our water laws that allows or requires this compensation and this transfer of water. So now we have a framework that is in the law that is starting to regulate these transactions that are meant for special situations, so for droughts, not for every day. So only if there is a bad situation, then human access to water, drinking water is the priority, and agriculture is going to have to give water under any circumstances. So let me finish there, and I'll take your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Oscar. Folks want to just raise their hands and all.
Yeah, thank you, Oscar. That was an impressive body of work in different areas and with different objectives and methodologies. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that interaction between your stakeholders and you talked about model outputs. I was also wondering if, based on the stakeholder input, there were cases where you went back and changed the design of the model. And my second related question is about, you said, asking the stakeholders what they value. But obviously we have, different categories of stakeholders here with very different valuations. And I was wondering how you tackled that. And finally, one of the major issues we've had in some of this Nexus modeling that we do, it's great to talk about integration, but there is this very critical issue of resolution of the model. What is your choice of the resolution, and choosing that resolution depending on what is feasible from a modeling perspective, and then what is relevant for decision makers. For example, in your Peru model, where you're looking at annual water demand, we found that the farmers here are not so much interested in the annual. What is really matters is the seasonal or even the everyday, scarcity, or particularly in the summers here, the seasonal part. So I was wondering what you did.
Thank you for the questions. No, those are very relevant, and I think I missed a little bit talking about the participation, which I think is key, and in this future work, we are emphasizing that aspect because we've learned that, I mean, if you don't start talking with the people from the beginning, then you can do a lot of models, but in the end, they might not be used, they might not be relevant, and then what's the point, right? So what we did in different countries, so in Peru was a bit different than in Ecuador. In the case of Peru, as I was mentioning, we had a hard time trying to have like permanent people, the same people from the agency participating because they were changing all the time. So we created a group of people that were interested in these topics, that had influence, but were more permanently discussing these issues. And so we took their knowledge and their suggestions in terms of what are the relevant questions. And in the case of Ecuador, they defined the scenarios. So we did a few workshops where we brought some ideas, of course, but they were the ones defining the scenarios we finally modeled. And that actually made us change the tool that we have developed, because the scenarios that they proposed were already defining the type of agriculture. So we didn't have to have a model to select the crops, because that was already put within the scenarios. In terms of the resolution, most of this work has been done at basin level, and I think depends a lot on the availability of data. So we try to work, I would say, with the most detailed data available, but these are in general areas that don't have a lot of data. So it has to be fairly simple in terms of the modeling approaches. In Chile now, there is a big effort in terms of water modeling. So there's been a new directive to develop models for every basin, and these are models that integrate underground water and superficial water. So there we have more detailed waters. And again, I think we start from what are the questions we want to answer. So it's usually questions not for the short term. They're not like everyday management decisions. These are generally questions for the medium or even the long term. And that's why we are looking at climate change. And the recommendations are going to be policies that might take a few years to implement, and the consequence will probably be seen in decades. So that's the level of resolution time and space resolutions that we're working for.
Great, super interesting. I also know that you have a lot of research on health. So I'm wondering if there's a way of linking health to all of these different angles, and whether you have some work on that, and if you can tell us something about that.
Yes, good question. No, I haven't, but I have thought about that. And one of the issues that we are seeing is this water markets by tracking. It's very interesting because municipalities are providing water with trucks, But then you see individuals, entrepreneurs, that they have the small trucks and like they carry like 1 cubic meter in the truck and they start selling around. But nobody's looking at the quality of that water. So the Ministry of Health is supposed to be overseeing that. And a recent article in the newspaper showed that it had been 2 years in some regions since they had done any checking. So there is informal water being spread around, which who knows what quality it has. And then there's nobody looking at the formal water market, what are the quality of that water. But in a survey we did in the coastal area, we see that people are obviously not stupid. So they know that they cannot rely on the quality of the water. So most of the people are doing a portfolio strategy in the sense that they buy this water. Sometimes they have a well and they would use that well, but they also buy water, bottled water, like water containers for drinking. So there is a health issue there, but we only have thought about it. We haven't looked really in detail. What we have looked a little bit is in terms of these health waves, heat waves, and the impact that is having on population and rural population. And that we have a little bit of modeling, but we have not connected with this approach, to be honest.
Thanks for your presentation. You said one thing that caught my attention particularly, which is that hydroelectricity is less popular now, and solar and wind and so on are becoming more popular, which I think is a trend in many parts of the world. But what I'm wondering is, there is a nexus over there also, obviously, right? You need the materials for solar and wind, and there is a land requirement, and depending on the technology, there's also going to be a water requirement. So I'm curious if you have thought about those connections. How is the nexus going to shift with the shift towards these other renewable sources of energy?
Yeah, no, definitely. The connection is there. We haven't done much research, but what we have found is that there's another element that is interesting, because in farming areas that have gone through droughts that last 10 years, so farmers are no longer able to do what they were doing before, sometimes they're close to the electric grid. And if that is the case, we've seen now a market where solar panel companies, they're more like electricity companies that install solar panels. They rent the land to farmers. So farmers don't sell the land, but they rent the land. They put solar panels, no more agriculture. They can sell or rent their water, and they get a rent from the solar panel generation. So there is definitely a connection in that sense. We haven't done much research, but it's clearly a land use destination that we're going to be seeing growing and growing. And if you go to the farm area, you're going to see long stretches of what used to be agricultural land. Now it's becoming energy generation.
Any other questions? I'll ask one. So I was really struck by kind of the number of different, I guess, scenarios or possibilities as outputs of some of these models. And I was just trying to get a sense, is that mostly like within a given climate scenario, that's all the different ways you could combine these different choices to get an output? Or is that giving us a sense of variability across multiple climate scenarios? And I guess what I'm trying to get at is, can you say anything about kind of like the robustness of some of these different trade-offs across sort of different possible climate trajectories?
Yes, so these results here, let me go back to make sure. For example, that one. So we're looking at different possible results that incorporate the different climate scenarios, but it does have, the uncertainty is sort of built in, and obviously it's hard to tell what, these are the global circulation models, right? So the climate models, it's hard to tell which one is better, so we use them all. And even the same, research center would have several runs of the same model. Which run is better? Nobody can tell. So we use all the runs. And that brings all the uncertainty into these tables. What is done here is that that uncertainty is kept, and I think it's seen better in this type of situation where all the possible scenarios are presented. But we try to narrow down the measures. So we see that some measures will give results that are inferior in every aspect. And those are removed. But the other ones are kept. So you can choose and maybe increase reliability, but then there are chances that things might not go as you expected because there is uncertainty in terms of the climate scenarios.
Thanks, Oscar, for the presentation. I was just curious on how you integrate quantitative data and qualitative data, and then how do you come up with some metrics like agricultural reliability or vulnerability? Do you have a proxy, and what does your group use?
Yes. No. So going back here, I didn't put all the definitions there. They're in the paper. So these are all quantitative measures. So agricultural benefits, hydropower production, reliability. It's defined in terms of the amount of time that you have enough water to supply all the needs of agriculture. And vulnerability, it's measured in terms of the cubic meters per second that is needed to supply that. So it's a measure of how much water you have, in a sense. And then resilience is in terms of the hydropower, the ability to go back to the same production you had before. So these are all quantitative metrics of how the system is working. What we have done in terms of more qualitative analysis is the way we present this to stakeholders and to interested parties, because sometimes it's hard to understand. There are a lot of issues, especially the uncertainty issues, really hard to explain and for people to understand that these are models that come from global research. So we simplify a little bit this scheme of things. And in the research, we try to understand what are the needs and what are the measures they think that would bring them there. And then we come back with the models and present exactly the results that we think they can expect with the measures they would like to be seen implemented. And from there, we start a conversation and see, okay, so this is what you wanted, this is what we think might happen to your system if you're a farmer, if you're a rural water provider, how many weeks in the year, for example, you won't have water. But in a sense, we have to start developing a language to understand each other. The research world, the research world, the more quantitative results, with the people that are there every day, going through the actual problems. So I'm not sure I answered your question correctly, but go ahead if I didn't.
All right, well, maybe we'll cut it off there and go have some snacks outside, right, Christy? Yeah, so thank you very much, Oscar, and please join us out in the courtyard. And our next seminar will be in 2 weeks with Effie Kezadou from the University of Leeds. Is it 3? I think it's, yeah, that's right. Sorry, 3 weeks. Thanks, Jenny.